Thank you very much, Nan, for the warm welcome on stage. I'm absolutely delighted to have been invited to speak at your conference, particularly in your centenary anniversary year. As Nan alluded to just then, I'm shortly to be celebrating my own anniversary, not 100 years, it's just very bad lighting in here. In the next couple of days, I will have been Chief Executive of Shelterbox for a full 12 months, and it has been the most wonderful 12 months. I can absolutely assure you of that. It's the most wonderful job. So I am here today to talk to you about one of the most amazing examples of what you as Rotarians support in the world, and how your support and engagement has really brought about change in the lives of people overseas. We certainly would not be the organisation we are today without your incredibly valuable support. So what does Shelterbox do? Well, for those of you who don't know about us, we provide emergency shelter and vital aid to stabilise, protect and support communities who have been overwhelmed by disaster and humanitarian crisis. We respond instantly to disasters such as earthquakes, volcanoes, floods, hurricanes, cyclones, and also conflict, man-made conflict, delivering humanitarian aid to communities in need on every continent on Earth. Shelterbox aid is pre-positioned in several locations throughout the world to enable a fast response if needed. And there's also a large stock of equipment in the warehouse at our headquarters in Helston in Cornwall, where Nan and her husband visited earlier this year. And we have around 150 volunteers on hand to help us pack these boxes, many of whom are local Rotarians. Shelterbox aid is tailored to the needs of each disaster. So we make sure that we are sending only the most efficient form of equipment by air or by sea, using local support or acting alone to make sure we are getting families exactly what they need in times of crisis. Now, we do this with support from our Shelterbox response team volunteers. These people are highly trained in field operations and accompany the aid to ensure it reaches those most in need. Again, a key way in which Rotary members support us by engaging in this way with us as Shelterbox response team volunteers. Now, Shelterbox aid, which you will see literally out in Centenary Square, all erected for you to go and have a look at, it consists of a green box filled with a tent and other life-saving equipment. Typically, it contains the disaster relief tent, which you'll see out in the square, which can house an extended family, thermal blankets, ground sheets, water storage, water purification equipment, solar lamps, cooking utensils, and a basic toolkit and mosquito net. For every donation of £590, we're able to send a shelter box to a family in need. So that covers the cost of the contents and the storage and the delivery to the final recipients. For colder countries, we can include boxes with more blankets and ground sheets, and also a thermal liner that makes the tent a lot warmer for the occupants. Sometimes, though, our aid is not packed in our iconic green boxes, but rather sent in bulk and palletised aid. It's really essential that we make sure the needs of those who have survived disasters are actually met by what we're delivering. And we also maximise your support and donor support, ensuring we only send what is really needed and appropriate for the situation and the culture. Shelterbox works very, very clearly to the needs relayed back to it from the field, and we're able to send specific standalone items, should they be requested, rather than items in the box. Again, making sure that people get what they need, and we're making sure donor support goes as far as it possibly can. Now, for those of you who haven't had a chance yet to go in and have a look at the tent, here it is, well, kind of up close and personal. Some of you are a little bit far away. But this is what is at the heart of the aid that Shelterbox provides, our family disaster relief tent. The tent has, in fact, undergone a series of evolutions since our first consignment was sent over 12 years ago. We work incredibly closely with a British tent designer called Van Gogh to make sure the tent is the best it can possibly be. And this latest version of the tent is designed to withstand extreme temperatures, intensive UV light, high winds, and heavy rainfall. Many alterations that came about for this latest version of the tent came as a direct result of feedback from beneficiaries. In particular, we have found in many of the places in which we deploy our aid, there are high temperatures. They tend to be tropical environments. And in those cases, we need extra ventilation for the occupants. And we've enhanced the reflective properties of the outer layer. So the tent can maintain a cooler temperature than it might have done in the past. And that's when our thermal liner becomes important, so we can restore the tent to its original thermal properties to retain heat. And that's incredibly useful on deployments in mountainous regions, such as northern Pakistan, or where we've been on the Turkish border with Syria over the last couple of years. We're really committed to making sure that we continue to evolve the tent to make sure it's the best possible disaster relief tent for families in need. So it's undergone rigorous testing by Vango, and we continue to feedback information from our beneficiaries. We know that although these are supposed to be emergency shelter tents, we in fact find them in situ, still being used by families up to 12 or even 24 months later. At that point, they've gone well beyond being emergency shelter, and they've in fact become homes. Just like Rotary, Shelterbox has worked almost everywhere in the world. So far, we've provided emergency disaster relief through over 230 responses in almost 90 different countries. And that map there gives you a sense of where we've been. I mentioned earlier our Shelterbox response team volunteers. We actually use volunteers across a range of the functions of Shelterbox, and this strongly reflects that ethos of the Rotary network. Our Shelterbox response team volunteers are highly trained individuals from around the world who travel to disaster areas to assess the need for our aid. They make sure that boxes get to those who need them the most and by any means available. They undergo rigorous training in field operations at our International Academy for Disaster Relief on the Lizard in Cornwall before they are qualified to be deployed in response to a disaster. We have a worldwide network of response team volunteers from Britain, from the US, from Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and even parts of Asia. We have our warehouse volunteers who are on hand to pack boxes in the warehouse in Helston. Late last year, we in fact hosted a visitor from Rotary International, a woman who perhaps some of you have met, Sharon Sear. Sharon and Mike Pollard, who was accompanying her, were actually visiting our Helston warehouse 2 days after Typhoon Haiyan struck the Philippines. We were clearly going through an enormous mobilisation. We'd called in every volunteer we could find, including our 2 Rotary International visitors upstairs. And Sharon and Mike even scored themselves a spot on local television because we had film cameras in as well, filming our volunteers packing boxes. So that was incredibly exciting for them. Finally, we have our volunteer speakers who represent Shelterbox around the UK, and many of our international affiliates follow the same speaker network. We're a large support base who work with local communities to engage around issues of disaster response, disaster relief, and work with schools, scouts, other areas of youth organisations, and community organisations. The strength of our volunteers is incredibly important to us. We think our paid staff amount to only about 10% of the overall human resource that we're able to mobilise in support of Shelterbox. Most recently, of course, we responded to our most complex disaster to date, Super Typhoon Haiyan in the Philippines. And this was where our relationship with the Rotary Network really came into its own. Within hours, Rotary clubs from around the country, and indeed Rotary clubs overseas, were doing their own form of mobilising. They were already out collecting money and raising awareness about what was happening in the Philippines. So I'm sure you're all aware of the enormous scale of destruction which the typhoon caused. Winds of 195 miles per hour, the largest ever storm recorded to have made landfall. This image here was taken by one of our Shelterbox response team volunteers in the Philippines in Tacloban on Leyte Island. And you'll probably be familiar with Tacloban from the news. It received an awful lot of coverage. It was easily the worst hit area for the storm and was in the invidious position of being at the head of a harbour. As the wind came up the harbour, it pushed enormous waves in front of it, and a lot of the damage that was done was equivalent of a tsunami hitting the town. So that's a picture there. So disaster preparedness is at the forefront of what we do at Shelterbox. As I said before, we have pre-positioned aid. And the Philippines itself is a disaster-prone country, and in fact we've been there, responded pretty much every year in the 14 years of Shelterbox's lifespan. And I think our response to the typhoon in November last year was the fourth critical disaster response we'd had in the Philippines in 2013 alone. But we are lucky enough to have pre-position aid at Clark Base on Luzon Island, not far from Manila. And that relationship with the Clark Air Base is actually strongly supported by local Rotary contacts, another way in which the Rotary network has supported us. And that meant that we were able to incredibly quickly mobilise aid in support of the victims of Typhoon Haiyan. Within 3 days, we were getting aid out of Clark and on its way down to the victims of the typhoon. We were able to call in more aid as more response team volunteers arrived in the Philippines, which came from pre-positioned stock in Dubai and in Melbourne, and also stock that went from our headquarters in Cornwall. This image shows where we have our aid pre-positioned strategically around the globe. But thinking again back to the Philippines typhoon, as more response teams arrived in November and December of last year, more assessments could be carried out, and we were aware that it was an enormous need and we were facing quite a complex situation. This image shows the level of devastation again in Tacloban, and again the impact that the tsunami-like effect of the waves has had. Now, it was an incredibly challenging response for Shelterbox, our response to Typhoon Haiyan. Now, why was that? Why was that more so when, in fact, the level of casualties is relatively low compared to some of the disasters that we've responded to? Well, the Philippines is made up, I think, of something like 900 separate islands, some of which are much more isolated and remote than others. So not only do we need to send teams to make assessments on these remote islands, but once need was found, the aid had to be transported there. And this was done largely using human donkeys, as you can see there, and much smaller boats, so fishing boats. And that caused real challenges in terms both of the volume and the speed with which we could transport aid. And indeed, in the first weeks after the disaster, due to the large scale of the international humanitarian response, the nearest airport, the nearest hub for sending in the aid, Cebu Airport, was clogged, and it was taking us some time to get aid through, along with many other aid organisations. But once that cleared, our aid was flowing through, and we were able to get out to some of those smaller islands. You'll be pleased to know that 5 months on, with your support and the support of Rotarians around the world, we've been able to distribute enough aid to shelter over 6,200 families across the path of the devastation caused by the typhoon. We've been able to distribute toolkits to assist families rebuilding their homes, as well as other single forms of aid such as mosquito nets, water filtration, and solar lamps. We heard from a Shelterbox supporter who is currently working for the UN Development Programme, who was saying to us he thought electricity wouldn't be switched back on in some parts of the Philippines for a full 12 months after the typhoon. So something like solar lamps in a town or a village with absolutely no lighting become an incredibly important aid item. Well, here you can see that 5 months on, that on the left there, an image of what the family was living in before Shelterbox arrived, and afterwards they've been able to clear the land around their home and put up a Shelterbox tent and live from there. So as of March this year, we had over 100 response team members deployed into the Philippines to help Haiyan-affected communities. That's the largest number ever of response team volunteers we've ever used in one disaster. Again, that speaks very strongly to the complexity and the duration of the response. At one point, there were 25 individual people actually in the Philippines. And they've come from across the world. We've had support from Germany, Norway, Sweden, Canada, New Zealand, the Philippines itself, China and Japan, just to name a few. This number of SRTs has been incredibly important to enable us to carry out our response to this disaster. Another key aspect of the way that we're working, and increasingly working, is in collaboration with other international humanitarian organisations. Very often, Shelterbox can't reach some of the communities that it wants to reach alone. And when that happens, we will work with other organisations. Here's a picture of a couple of individuals from Plan International in particular, to make sure that by working together and coordinating, we can reach some of the communities that haven't otherwise been reached. So as well as working with Plan International, we've worked with a range of others, such as Handicap International, International Organisation for Migration, as well as working in with the UN, inside the UN collaboration system called the Shelter Cluster System. And that's an incredibly important thing to do to make sure that our response is lined up with, coordinated with, consistent with what other organisations are doing, so that nobody is left out in terms of receiving aid and there's no duplication. Again, that speaks very strongly to the need to make sure we're all using our donors' money and our donors' support as effectively as we possibly can. But the Shelterbox response is ongoing in the Philippines, and although the distributions of emergency shelter and other important aid are now winding down and we're exiting the emergency phase, we're still there carrying out monitoring and evaluation of the work that we have done, and also seeing how else we can support families and communities to get back on their land, get their livelihoods going, and keep their families together. So again, another picture there of Tacloban, one of the worst affected areas. Here, though, emergency aid distributions have gone on for a lot longer than originally anticipated because of the scale and complexity of the disaster, as you can see here. One of the utter joys of my job is the opportunity to meet some of the recipients of Shelterbox aid. And I'd like to introduce you to a couple of those recipients now, because they really are the people who you should all meet, but of course many of you will probably never get a chance to do that, because these are the people who you have helped. So this is Hazel, her husband and their baby are one of the families that you've helped. And they live on a remote island where the majority of the homes were wiped out by the typhoon. Their daughter was actually born on the night of the storm, and she was named after Typhoon Yolanda, which is what Typhoon Haiyan is known as locally, as a tribute to the storm that they say created a miracle out of the destruction. Hazel told one of our volunteers that she remembered being more afraid of the typhoon than giving birth. And for those mothers amongst you, you'll probably think, oh my goodness, that must have been quite a typhoon. So Hazel now lives in a Shelterbox tent with her husband and the baby. And of course, it's more than just a tent to them. It will always be remembered as their baby's first home. Hazel said, "We are so happy with the Shelterbox tent because when we came out of the midwife's house, we didn't have a house anymore to go back to. Now this tent is our home." That's just one of the beneficiaries that you have helped. This is Diana Mirador. She has 6 children, the youngest of whom is 4 years old. She lives on the south of Leyte Island in a village called Dulag. A large coconut tree fell across the roof of her home, smashing it into a pile of splintered wood. The family survived only because they had moved into a neighbour's more substantial concrete house. So coconut palms are an incredibly important part of many people's livelihoods in the Philippines. So not only has this family lost their home, but they've probably also lost their livelihood. Diana says, "We will replant new palm trees, but they take around 10 years to mature. But thanks to the generosity of donors like yourselves, Diana and her family can at least move out of the cramped makeshift shelter they were living in since the typhoon destroyed their home. As Diana said, we will all be able to sleep together safely now." So this image shows Diana with her youngest child, happy with their new tent. Again, somebody else that you have helped. And finally, a third person that I'd like you to meet. This is 84-year-old Victoria Cabrera. She has many children and grandchildren. The youngest of her grandchildren is just 18 months old. She and her family lost their homes on the isolated island of Bantayan. Victoria now shares her tent with some of her extended family, and she said, "Thank you, thank you." For communities that live in large family groups, being separated and being made to live in emergency in schools or other kinds of communal accommodation is an incredibly difficult thing for them to do. So thank you. Finally, I'd just like to say that it's not just our Shelterbox response teams, warehouse box packers, staff members and partners in the field that have helped us to do this amazing work in the Philippines. It's thanks to our supporters around the world who helped raise awareness and helped raise the funds to help us help the most vulnerable families like those that we've just seen. Communities around the world united to help us bring shelter and other aid to survivors through box collections and a myriad of different events. Several major media outlets and celebrity ambassadors rallied by Shelterbox to help spread awareness of our response. This is 9-year-old Millie. She said that she was watching the news when there was a bit about Typhoon Haiyan hitting the Philippines. She said, "There was a particular story about a dad and a mum and their daughter in a house. At the time of the typhoon, they hid under the table and the little girl's dad put his motorbike helmet on to stay safe. I felt like I had to do something, so I decided to do a sponsored silence. I'll be silent for the whole day at school, raising funds for Shelterbox." We are very grateful and thankful to everyone like Millie who raised awareness and funds to help us do our work in the Philippines. As we continue helping families in the Philippines, as well as other communities affected by disaster and humanitarian crisis around the world, at the moment we're active in Bolivia and Zimbabwe, as well as around Syria, we would like to express how incredibly grateful and humbled we are by the support that is constantly shown to us by the Rotary International Network. Together, Shelterbox and Rotary are making a difference to families' lives around the world at the time when they need it the most. I want to thank you so much for your continued support and let you know that we're doing everything to reach more people in times of crisis. Thank you very much for your time and congratulations on your 100th anniversary.